The Eurovision Song Contest has gained a new member, and it's the famously extremely European country, Canada. This might seem like a total bolt from the blue. And to be honest, I think many people didn't really believe this would ever happen. But in some ways, to be honest, we've kind of been expecting this for a while. Today, we're going to go through the announcement, look at how this is actually a really different arrangement to the one that brought Australia to the contest, as well as thinking about some potential artists and what it might mean for Eurovision in the long run. Firstly, here's what we know. Last week at the European Broadcasting Union's General Assembly, that's the organisation that governs Eurovision, Canada was admitted as a full member after the rules were changed to allow a few non-European countries to join in theory if they met a set of standards that are extremely strict. In practice, this will probably only ever apply specifically to Canada. By becoming a full member of the EBU, they're on the same standing as anybody else who's in the Eurovision Song Contest. That means that unlike Australia, which needed an invitation to join in 2015, Canada can just do it like anyone else with no obstacles in their way. By contrast, for Australia, initially in 2015, it was a one-off exception. Their broadcaster, SBS, then signed a bespoke deal with the EBU that allowed them to continue to participate. They also received an automatic qualification in that first year as they were a sort of guest that was only meant to be participating once. But since then, they've always been in the semi-finals. Since Canada is joining in the normal way, I wouldn't expect any of this kind of fanfare or any kind of red carpet rolled out in this way. I would expect them to participate on the same standing as everyone else. In fact, so far there seems to have been a lot of emphasis being put on the fact that Canada is becoming an EBU member first and then joining Eurovision as a bonus. I think that's why the announcements were separated. Let me start out by saying this. I am not at all surprised that this has happened. Canada made the exploration of Eurovision participation a key priority in its annual budget last year, and the contest will be more than happy in its current state to welcome the very hefty participation fee that Canada would be paying, given that it's such a high-income country and that it has a population of more than 40 million. Martin Green, who's the Eurovision director, said in a press conference just last month that the door was open for Canada to join, saying that anyone was welcome if they share the values of this wonderful occasion, which is a massive narrative change from previously. As a result, for some months, I think a lot of people within the Eurovision community have maybe seen this coming. It's interesting who that shares our values approach seems to apply to in the eyes of the organisation, but that's not a conversation for today. The question of why this is happening now specifically, both in terms of Canada joining the EBU and Eurovision, is easy enough to answer. As Canada's relationship with the United States has soured, they've sought closer ties to Europe and the EU on a political, economic and cultural level. Eurovision is an entirely logical way of doing that, and it builds in a regularly scheduled signal to the world that Canada wants to be perceived as being in ideological and political alignment with Europe. As well as that, being a full EBU member will give every public broadcaster in Europe the right to use the Canadian broadcaster's news footage in their own coverage. So in theory, this should make it easier for news organizations in smaller European countries who don't necessarily have the resources to send a news crew to Canada for a story to show on-the-ground footage more easily of those stories anyway. This is actually one of the key benefits of EBU membership. On the flip side, it says something about Eurovision that the organizers have been at pains to deny in recent years. Eurovision and the EBU are not, in fact, apolitical. Organizations like the EBU will always make decisions based on what is geopolitically helpful in the wider European context. It's no wonder that Canada can sail in as they have, while Kazakhstan has been banging on the door for more than a decade with no luck whatsoever. It's a matter of simple fact that the contest is a cultural touchstone for internationalist, for liberal, and for outward-looking values. I just really wish that the organisers would wave that flag proudly all the time and be consistent about applying those values, rather than simply awkwardly picking it up when it's convenient and then dropping it the second that it's not. In any case, Canada is going to be there in Sofia in 2027, and there's no better way to welcome a new member to the Eurovision family than by making a whole bunch of baseless theories and predictions about who might end up representing them. For that reason, I'm going to throw 3 artists out there that, in my opinion, have some of the relevant signs to indicate that they might be realistic options for Canada, although some of them are more hopeful than others. We're going to start, though, with someone that isn't actually making their first appearance in a video on this channel, and that is Baby No Money. Yes, I know the Armenia thing didn't happen, I was totally wrong about that, but I honestly, genuinely wouldn't be surprised if by the time I post this video, Baby No Money has already taken to TikTok to make some kind of reaction to this news. There's a whole bunch of reasons why he's interested in Eurovision and why it would work for him at the current stage of his career. The first is the easiest and most obvious to state, which is that he clearly has some level of interest in it. He's gone out of his way to work with several past Eurovision artists, including releasing a song with Käärijä at the back end of 2025. So it's clear that this is in his orbit and that his interest still persists to some level to this day. Secondly, I think this is an arrangement that works for the Canadian broadcaster and for the contest right now. What Dara proved is that it is the right time in Eurovision for pop music that is modern and commercially successful and relevant in a way that it hasn't always been in recent years. Baby No Money would offer a dimension of that in a way that most artists who might be willing to participate in Eurovision couldn't necessarily do to the same degree. This is a guy with hundreds of millions of streams. It would be a massive statement of intent from the Canadian side, and it would probably have a very good chance of success in the televote especially. This is somebody who already has a fan base internationally. The other thing for the broadcaster is about establishing Eurovision as a domestic TV staple, because unlike with Australia, they're basically starting from scratch here. There is a small fan community, but for Australia, it existed for 30 years before the contest, and it was active and it came to the show every year. With Canada, it's there, and I see it in my demographics. It's just not necessarily on the same scale yet. That could represent an opportunity though. If you have somebody like Baby No Money, that is your best chance to attract the kinds of demographics like 18 to 30-year-olds who don't necessarily normally interact with linear media. Then once you get people in the door with the big name, hopefully some of them like the show enough that they'll stick around and they'll watch it the next year in any case. As well as that, unlike with Australia, time zones are on our side, because with Canada, the final would be starting up at some point in the afternoon on Saturday. At the moment, for all of these reasons, he is top of my desired list and the one who I think would be the best choice tactically for the Canadian broadcaster as well. Obviously, it's a tough one, but I will keep my fingers crossed. If we don't get Baby No Money, one other option could be to choose an artist looking to build an international platform who already has some links to the contest. There were a few that appealed to me for this, but I have decided to go for Rev. Rev is somebody who has already had some level of commercial success. She generated a gold certified single with Control-Alt-Delete, which appeared on her first album that was released in 2022. She makes the kind of relevant modern pop music that I already mentioned that I think Canada should be pushing in the contest. And as well as that, she's a charismatic live performer with a really good vocal and the kinds of major label backing that could help make sure we get a really high production performance. The thing is, everything I've said so far could apply to a lot of people. So you may quite fairly be asking why I've chosen Rev specifically. That's because of her past work with the duo Banks and Ranks, who among other things produced and co-wrote Évidemment by Lazara, which represented France at Eurovision in 2023. If the broadcaster wanted to turn to domestic Canadian talent that already had some familiarity or had associates with some familiarity with Eurovision, Banks and Ranks would be the place to turn to, and then they're likely to turn and work with artists that they've collaborated regularly with. Rev is one of those. They've even shared the stage at awards shows in the past. Again, what this depends on is the kind of direction that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation chooses to go with its first effort. There is no guarantee that they will be as forward-thinking or as brave as this. Dara as well, for Bulgaria, may have won with the kinds of things that Rev is able to produce. But she was still a black sheep in the context of Eurovision at the moment. It's a sign of what's going to come next, but it's no guarantee that you can replicate that with the same sort of thing. At the same time, the best chance of doing that and of attracting the most high-profile and talented people to try and do that is when you're doing your first participation. There's that novelty and that shine that might attract higher profile artists than you might usually get. That kind of means has to happen this year. My final prediction is one that is not realistic. It comes about 99% from hope, because this is an artist I have loved for a really long time and someone who I'm particularly into at the moment because I saw them live in London about 2 days ago. That artist is Faouzia, someone who I have been waiting for an excuse to talk about in a video for a really, really long time. I have been idly wondering about how she would do in a Eurovision context ever since she released Born Without a Heart and Tears of Gold, which were now more than half a decade ago. But now with Canada joining, it might actually be a possibility, even if it's just remote. Those songs I just mentioned are two of her best known, along with Minefields, which was a collaboration she did with John Legend. As well as that, she has occasionally gone viral on various platforms with videos of her live performances because her vocal is absolutely exceptional. Having heard it live, I kind of felt like I saw God. Her range and her control is just utterly ridiculous. And in recent years, she's only got better, both with her stage charisma and with her technical ability as well. You can feel her personality shining through more than ever on her most recent album. And that's the one that she's been touring with at the moment. By the time next year comes around, this phase will be done and there will be room for something new. The other thing that I noticed that could help her here is actually the opposite to the previous one. It's great to have a major label backing you if that label will say yes to Eurovision. But in terms of the likelihood of getting an artist in if they're independent, there's less people along the line who could say no before you finally sign the paper. Faouzia is now an independent artist, and for that reason, there is maybe a slightly elevated chance that it could work out. For me, while this is the most unlikely of the three by a long way, to be honest, I think it is a really, really remote possibility. I think Faouzia has the highest ceiling out of basically anybody that they could choose. We know that vocals aren't enough alone to win the jury vote, but the music that she's making now is so innovative and interesting, but also accessible, that when you combine that with her genuinely ridiculous level of vocal ability, you could produce something really, really special. Even at 75% of her best, I think she could win the jury outright. Canada will be a bit of a wild card in the televote. We don't know how the European public is going to react, but if an effort from her was as special as some of the songs that she's put on this album, then the sky really, really is the limit. I do feel like I should put a massive hopium disclaimer here, just because I am obviously a massive, massive fan, and that is going to wildly skew my opinions. For that reason, obviously take what I am saying with a pinch of salt. I would have hoped you were doing that anyway. In any case, all three of these artists represent, for me, the kind of statement that Canada should be making as it joins the contest. They're modern artists, they have clear and broad appeal, and they each have their own potential motivations to maybe decide to throw their hat into the ring. They would help set out Canada's stall as a country that will be on the cutting edge of the contest rather than playing it safe. Australia demonstrated in 2026 that an English-speaking country that knows what it's doing can do very, very well. And for Britain, and potentially for Ireland if they do return, it's going to be yet another indication of just how bad at this thing we really are. In the long run, I think it's also going to be interesting to see what new ground Canada participating takes us into. It's pretty clear, in my view, that this is a case of the EBU and Eurovision willingly being channeled as part of a wider effort to align Canada with Europe. And you can't help but wonder what happens if other key allies outside of the EU and outside of Europe emerge in the near future. We have no idea if this kind of courtesy would extend to countries with less economic power or countries that don't speak English or another major Western language as their primary one. Both Australia and Canada bear these traits, and I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. Overall, I am choosing at this stage to be quietly optimistic about this development, because in my view, it moves the contest closer to being honest about how it sees itself and how the world sees it. There's no shame in being a touchstone for a liberal and internationalist worldview, and I suspect that that is the predominant viewpoint among the people watching the show as well. It's important and necessary to continually evolve the competition. And also, God knows it's an event that needed some good news right now. Only time will tell if this one is going to come off, but I'm choosing to be optimistic for the time being. And if it's done right, it could bring all kinds of positive effects to the contest. Thank you for joining me on this very unusual video, released on a Wednesday of all days, that I have put together as quickly as I possibly could after the announcement. By the way, don't think it's a coincidence. Today is Canada Day. So if you guys are watching, congratulations or happy Canada Day or whatever it is you say today. I'm kind of new to this, but I guess I'll be learning more about Canada in the coming year. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because there is no off-season here. Eurovision Asia is going to be coming soon, and if this news is anything to go by, then it is going to be a busy few months in general. For now, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you again very soon.